Hi, welcome back. Before we begin today's episode, I want to share an important warning with you. This documentary contains discussion of allegations involving sexual abuse, exploitation, and sex trafficking of minors, which may be disturbing for some viewers. So please take care while you're listening. Everything presented here is based on publicly available information, including court filings, official law enforcement statements, and investigative reporting. It is also very important to know that many individuals that appear and whose names appear in publicly released documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein have not been charged with crimes, and being referred in records, photographs, contact list, or flight logs doesn't mean they actually done something wrong. This video is for entertainment and education purposes only, focusing on verifying legal timeline and what has been made public through the justice system. With that said, this is part 1 of the Jeffrey Epstein case, the story of how Epstein rose into the extraordinary wealth, how the first criminal investigation began, how a controversial plea deal took place, and how in 2019 the case returned with such a force that just shook the world. Grab the food and let's begin. Before Jeffrey Epstein became one of the most infamous names connected with wealth abuse and unnamed question, he was to much of the world a figure almost invisible in plain sight, moving quickly through the elite spaces, surrounded by money, influence, and a kind of mystery that seemed to protect him for decades. To understand how Epstein ended up in a federal prison in 2019, facing some of the most serious charges of his life, you have to look much earlier, long before the headlines, before the court filings, and long before his name became synonym with one of the most disturbing criminal scandals in the modern era. Jeffrey Epstein was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1953, and by most accounts, his early life wasn't suggesting the later life that he will have, because he came from a middle-class background. He went to public schools and for a time appeared to be on a path that looked, let's say, ordinary. In the 1970s, Epstein began working as a teacher at Dalton School, which is one of the best private schools in Manhattan, where the children of powerful families were going there to learn. But, he didn't start this on a right foot. He lied to get in there. He met a lot of wealth families in there, so he opened a lot of doors for himself, for then and for later. He was a person that could manipulate you just by the words. He could switch the conversation in the direction he wanted. From there, Epstein entered to the world of finance, first working with Bear Stearns, and over time he presented himself as a skilled and exclusive money manager, someone who handled the fortune for the ultra-rich people. He was basically cultivating an image of secrets and exclusivity, the kind of person whose business was conducted behind the closed doors. You never knew who were his clients. Between 1980s and 1990s, Epstein had become extraordinarily wealthy, which is a bit controversial because no one exactly knows how he became wealthy. Many are saying that he blackmailed some very important people, because unlike any other rich person, he didn't have any big company or firm to make money with. He just seemed that he was operating through the private arrangements. He was always surrounded by very powerful people, and his life became extreme luxury. He owned multiple properties, including a mansion in Manhattan, a large estate in Palm Beach, a ranch in New Mexico, and later a private island in the US Virgin Islands, the island that became famous even to this day. And all these locations will eventually become the center to the allegations against him, because prosecutors and survivors described them not simply as homes, but as settings where exploitation was taking place. For years, Epstein moved through high society. He was photographed with politicians, celebrities, princes, academics, business leaders, cultivating an image that suggested wealth, brilliance. While beneath that image, later was confirmed that the reality was totally different. By the early 2000s in Palm Beach, Florida, the law enforcement began to receive reports that Epstein was engaging in inappropriate and criminal behavior with minors. And what started as an individual complaint soon began to reveal a pattern that investigators found deeply alarming. The allegations described a system where young girls were attracted by other young girls to come to Epstein's house in Palm Beach and promised money if they will do a massage for Epstein. When the girls were recruited, they were never told what's gonna happen. They were just told that they will get money. When they were getting to his house, the situation was becoming sexualized and abusive. Survivors later said that the money were not used just as a payment, but as a tool of manipulation. This was creating the cycle where the victims were encouraged to bring other victims. This was becoming so large that it wasn't anymore about just a few people, it was a full trafficking network. Palm Beach police opened an investigation, and as they gathered statements, the scope of the accusation continued to grow, with multiple victims coming forward. They were all describing similar experiences, and the investigators started to uncover something big, not just an isolated crime. In 2006, Epstein was arrested in Florida, and what followed became one of the most controversial moments, because despite the serious allegations he was facing and the numbers of reported victims, Epstein ultimately reached a plea deal where in 2008 many critics and journalists were describing this as unbelievable. Under the agreement, Epstein pleaded guilty to state charges related to solicitation and procurement of a minor, serving approximately 13 months in prison, but with work release privileges, and also a deal of protection for everyone that is connected to his name. Now, the work release privileges, what that means. So basically, he was allowed to leave the jail whenever he wanted for work, and then he had to come back by the end of the day, so he was basically out of jail 12 hours a day. Now, some investigators were checking on him, and they were seeing that he was leaving to different places, so he basically was doing whatever he wanted. After a few years, Epstein returned to his normal wealthy life, maintaining properties, and continued to associate himself with different influential people. While many survivors thought that this, the justice hasn't been served, and no one knows what actually is hiding behind all those allegations, because it wasn't only that, it was much more. But the stories like this, they never stay buried forever, and the victims will always tell them story. They don't just disappear. And the questions remained, so different investigators and journalists started to take a deep dive into his past life and into what he's actually doing. That's how, few years later, the plea agreement was uncovered. The accusations extend to a different level. We weren't talking anymore about just Florida or just America, we were talking about international. And everyone was talking about how Epstein was able to escape meaningful accountability for far too long. A major turning point came through some reporters from some federal agents who exposed how prosecutors had failed to pursue federal charges despite the evidence that was against Epstein. Considering the numerous victims, the public just started to shake, and Epstein's story began to shift from a scandal whispered in legal circles to a national outrage. By late 2010, pressure was mounting, not only from survivors but from public, because no one could accept that someone with Epstein resources can continue to do horrible things and just get away with it. And then in 2019, everything changed. Federal prosecutors in New York announced that Epstein had been arrested on new charges of sex trafficking and conspiracy, alleging that between 2002 and 2005, he has sexually exploited and abused dozens of underage girls. And at this time, unlike in Florida, Epstein was placed into federal custody, facing the possibility of decades in prison. The arrest just sent shockwaves to the world. Everyone was shocked because Epstein got away with it so long, and now finally he got caught. He's not having the privilege anymore to escape the prison. And people were hoping that this time the justice will be served. People started to think and to ask questions about who else was implicated in those horrible things that happened. Because it can't be just him. He was associating with so many different personalities, so many different celebrities, businessmen. So people were wondering, what if he's not the only one in there doing all those horrible things? Of course, Epstein pleaded not guilty, and he requested multiple times to be released on bail, but the prosecutors were trying their best not to let this happen, describing him as a flight risk because he was having private jets. He was a very influential person with immense wealth, so leaving Epstein alone, that means he can run away at any point. Luckily, the court denied bail for Epstein, and he was sent to Metropolitan Correction Center in Manhattan, a federal jail where, for the first time in years, the man who had lived behind gates and luxury, now he's confined behind bars. And as Epstein was waiting in his cell, the world was also waiting to see what's gonna happen, because for the first time it seemed possible that the story will be finally told in a courtroom. The charges brought against him were severe, with the prosecutors alleging that Epstein had sexually exploited and abused underage girls, and that he had operated with a network of recruiters who helped facilitate all the encounters that happened. Authorities described this as a pattern of trafficking and exploitation rather than just misconduct. The case was assigned to the Southern District of New York, one of the most powerful prosecution in the country, and from beginning the prosecutors argued that Epstein was having a massive risk, not only because of his wealth but also because of his influences and private travels. After the judge agreed that Epstein needs to remain in the Metropolitan Correction Center, investigators were not only preparing for trial but also expanding their efforts, because the arrest opened the door to check Epstein's past associates, his finances, and the scope of what prosecutors believed that occurred behind the closed doors for years. Federal agents executed searches on Epstein's properties, including the one in Manhattan, And prosecutors later stated that investigators recovered large quantities of photographs, digital media, and other material that they considered relevant to the case, although a lot of it remained sealed to protect the victims. Public attention became overwhelming because Epstein was no longer a background figure in whispered scandals. He was now the center of an international storm. Survivors were coming forward, journalists were digging even deeper, and the public asked the same question repeatedly. How this happened for so long? For survivors in 2019, the arrest represented something that was seemed impossible for years because many were believing that Epstein will never face any serious charges due to the nature of his associates, people that he knew, and his wealth. And finally, for the survivors, it was possibility of a trial where they can testify against him so he can be held accountable for everything that he done. But inside the detention center, Epstein's situation was unstable because he was not an ordinary inmate. He was one of the most high-profile detainee in the country. And his presence there create a lot of pressure of how they managing his custody. Now, in late of July 2019, Epstein was found in his cell injured with some marks on his neck. Now, everyone was thinking that he might try and commit suicide, and they placed him under suicide watch temporarily. This event immediately put some thoughts in people's mind that Epstein might not survive to stand the trial because the public disgrace that was coming towards him might affect his self-pride. After a period of monitoring, Epstein was released from the suicide watch and placed back into a special housing unit. Now, everyone was preparing for trial in the next few days, but what was about to happen was shifting the entire story. On August 10, 2019, Epstein was found dead in his cell. Emergency responders attempted resuscitation, but he was pronounced dead shortly after. Within hours, the news were spread across the world, and this was a big hit for the survivors because he will never actually have to pay for what he done. He will never have to face them in court and look at them and be held accountable for what he has done for many years. The officials said that Epstein died by suicide, by hanging. Even the circumstances surrounding his death started to put many questions in people's head, like a lot of conspiracy theories appeared, a lot of questions appeared. Is he actually dead, or he just faked his death, or did someone want him dead? So many questions that people started to ask, and they even ask to this day. The Department of Justice opened an investigation into the failures of the detention center, and they reported that the guards weren't following the procedure, they weren't checking on him as they were supposed to, and that staffing shortages and administrative breakdowns contributed to the environment in which Epstein was able to die. But beyond the operational failures, Epstein's death carried enormous legal consequences because the criminal case against him ended instantly. There will be no trial, there will be no cross-examination, and there will be no final verdict that could formally establish the guilt in a way that only a completed criminal trial can do it. As I said, for many survivors, Epstein's death was not closure but was a form of denial because it meant that the person accused of harming them would never be sentenced by a jury. And the full story of what prosecutors believed he had done would never be laid out in court. Almost immediately, the attention shifted to the network surrounding Epstein. Because if Epstein was gone, then the focus turned to who helped him, who enabled him, and who protected him for so many years. This is where the case of Ghislaine Maxwell became central, because Maxwell was described as Epstein associate for a long time. She was eventually arrested and charged, leading to a later conviction that became the most significant criminal outcome connected to Epstein's operation. And we will cover this in part 2. Soon after Epstein's death, the world was left suspended between outrage and uncertainty because Epstein had died at the very moment when the full machinery of justice was closing in. His death also intensified the interest into the evidence that investigators had collected, because people believed that within the closed records, digital files, flight logs, and contact books, there might be answers why Epstein never faced court. Yet much of the evidence remained closed because of the sensitive information and to protect the victims. In the next part, the story will continue not through Epstein himself, but the documents, the unsealed records, the civil lawsuit, the Maxwell prosecution, and the slow release of information that has kept this case alive in public memory even to this day. If you liked part 1 of Jeffrey Epstein documentary, please leave a comment about what you think, leave a like and a subscribe. And of course, let me know what other cases I should cover in here. And don't forget, everyone has some unseen motives behind their evil behavior. Take care.